clearly. Thank you. We also want to acknowledge the American Sign Languages. We also want to acknowledge the land that we're in. We are located on the indigenous land of the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, and Wyandot nations. Next slide, please. Here is an overview of our lunch agenda, where we will invite our director of the QualLab, professor of Ed Studies in EHE at The Ohio State University, and also editor of the Review of Higher Education, Dr. Pasquay, to give us a welcome and tell us a little bit more about the QualLab. Next slide, please, and welcome, Dr. Pasquay.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and I'm so glad that everyone is here. I appreciate you all taking the time to join us. The QualLab is a research center that specializes in really training and advancing qualitative methodologies, non-methodologies, post-qualitative work, and we work within the College of Education and Human Ecology, where we do consultations and help people within the college, but we also do different things like this. Events such as the QualLab lunches. We have a grad student board that's incredible. The GRAs are really amazing and thoughtful. And today is one of our main events about to happen. And I'm so happy to have the speaker with us. So I know she'll be introduced in a little bit. But I also want to say I really appreciate the work that the people who are here listening to the presentation are doing to advance issues of social justice, innovation, equity, diversity, because that's what the QualLab is all about. So thanks to the team that put this on, but also thanks to all of you for continuing to push this work further and further, because we need it. So with that, I'll pass it back to Ruth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pasquay, for your remark and for your vision, and welcome. Just some additional housekeeping tips for today's Zoom session. Please turn your camera on and keep your microphones off when the speakers are in session. And please share your comments and questions in the Zoom chat space. And please note that this session is being recorded, and this session will be available on the QualLab webpage a few days after today. And in addition to our ASL interpretation, closed captioning is also provided throughout the session. Thank you. And next slide, please. Now, let's get to another important component of the QualLab team, our graduate student board. The QualLab Graduate Student Board is an organic, graduate student-led group that fosters meaningful engagement with the qualitative research process, from theory to practice. Next slide, please. Shea Valley is a graduate student leader in the GSC, and in fact, it is their efforts that made today's lunch talk with Dr. Nicolazzo possible. So thank you very much, Shea, for your leadership, and please allow me to introduce you. Shea Valley is a second-year MA student in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program and the program coordinator for the Department of Political Science at The Ohio State University. They are a member of the QualLab GSC and contributed to the team's recent publication, Radical Interrelated Qualitative Space in the Midst of Multi-Pandemics, a collaborative, scholarly personal narrative. After graduating with their master's degree, they hope to pursue a PhD program and contribute to the growing field of trans studies. Let's welcome them and let them introduce our speaker today.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. I am so excited that you could be with us today. I know that I am very excited to hear our speaker, so let's get to it. we have Dr. Z. Nicolazzo here with us. She is an associate professor of trans studies and education at the Center for the Study of Higher Education and a member of the Trans Studies Initiative at the University of Arizona. And she will discuss how grief is present through absence in her qualitative work. We have a wonderful quote from her here. This absence creates an affective door through which to think and feel in profound ways if we attend to it. However, we're often trained not to. So what does this training away from affect mean then for how we experience qualitative research as well as how research moves others? So it is my pleasure to stop sharing my screen and pass off the talk to Dr. Nicolazzo.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Good afternoon to folks on the East Coast. Good morning to the people who are over here on the West Coast, and good day to people in the middle, I guess, depending on how you think about time. I'm gonna probably not so swiftly start sharing my screen, so hopefully folks can see the presentation. So hopefully y'all can see the presentation at this point, and we'll begin. All right. Oops. Let's see. Okay. So first, I'd like to give some thanks and do some recognition. So first, I want to give thanks and recognize the lands, the flora, and the fauna of the Tohono O'odham Nation, which is the ongoing territory of the Tohono O'odham and Pasco Yaqui peoples, and is where I'm currently sitting right now. Also, I'd like to recognize and give thanks to the banks of Freeze's Pond and what is now known as Deerfield, New Hampshire, which resides on the Pennacook, Wabanaki, and Abenaki lands. I'd also like to give recognition and pause and think about the waterways across and through which Black populations have been made landless and which bear the ongoing weight of living in the wake of chattel slavery. May those of us who are non-Black never look away from the violent altering forces of anti-Blackness, all while constantly seeking to cultivate better underworlds than the reality of the here now. I'd also like to give big thanks to the entire QualLab's team, but most especially to Shay and Penny at The Ohio State University. Thanks for this generous invitation and for allowing me to share some new work and thinking with everyone. Thanks to all in attendance too for what probably will be some sputtering and stumbling along from me today. I hope I can offer something that is of some interest and substance and that may spark further discussion during our shared time during question and answer. And I also want to finally give thanks to my queer family, some of whom I see in the participant group. So always nice to see you all here. And most especially to my beautiful partner, Em. Without you all, I would not have been able to make it to today, let alone think about tomorrow. So with that, I'll take an awkward sip of water and then we'll get going. He called, but I did not pick up. I was writing and he often derailed me. Without looking, I sent him a text. Slammed today with work. Can call you back later, probably around 7 p your time. Blurg, 8 p I mean. He texted back, okay, call when you can. When I called, he said those words. I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I dared not to. I couldn't. Look at your text messages, he said. So I did. I pulled them up and took a screenshot because what he said was not there. And just as I was about to send him the screenshot, it appeared. Mom's dead. She was ready, but I clearly was not. Had not been, refused to be. There's a stickiness to grief. It sticks to the ribs, to the body, to the organs. It constricts and constrains. I've found over the past 2 days, I need to remind myself to breathe, that I have to be mindful of something that should be automatic is unmooring. Breathe in, hold it, breathe out. My grief is a bad house guest. It refuses to leave. It lingers too late in the evening, wakes me during the night, and greets me in the morning. There is an immobility to grief, a way that it holds me in place. It pulls me in, sucks me back, envelops me in its expanse. I know I need to leave my bed each morning, but I don't know how. I've lost the ability to do much of anything beyond texting the people who are checking in on me and weeping. And in a cruel twist of irony, there is even immobility in that, as all I want to do, sob, vent, mourn publicly, I feel unable to do. Even the vocalization of my grief has become immobile, intractable, impossible. I text my brother, there's so much food. People keep asking about and sending and bringing food. I think my brother is also in shock, but it's hard to know. That's very nice, he replies, but I think he missed the point of my text. It's the overwhelming nature of grief that I am pointing toward, the way none of us really know what to do, and that I do not know what I need, which I know leads to people not knowing what to do. The food helps, but it also sticks. Grief and sweets fuse, commingle with the ripped pieces of challah and washed down with Prosecco from the local co-op. Just like I need to remind myself to breathe, I need to also remind myself to eat and drink. Yesterday, I got a text from a friend, water check. Spilling more than drinking, I reply, just lost it in the shower, just sat down and sobbed. Grief sticks, even in the slickness of a shower stream. It is a bad house guest, not even letting me have a moment to myself to sit, to cry in the shower. Grief is immobilizing. I go back to my last text messages with my mom, sent Saturday, 22nd August, just 5 days before she passed. Listening to First Aid Kit and thinking of how much I love you, Mom. So good to hear your voice today, XX. I know she is not there, that she will never read this message, but I feel compelled to text her again. I cannot leave where I am standing until I do. I am rooted in place. Grief has me stuck, rooted in its grips. My fingers shake as I silently sob and type, I love you to the moon and back, Mom. Miss you so much. Grief sticks. It's now stuck to fond memories of sharing music with her, of her loving the music and thinking of me when she listened to it, of the phrase she used to say to me, I love you to the moon and back. The moon, ruler of the tides, a feminine creature, fitting that. Makes sense that in this last exchange, the last time I will ever communicate with her, even if she will not read it, is one of women conversing across the feminine, the celestial. The night I found out she died, I went outside and looked at the moon. I got my phone out to take a picture. I thought, I love you to the moon and back. Our language, one that has stuck across time and now remains across planes. It's hard to know what to focus on. Things are moving with a particular velocity and force today. My brother wants to talk about picking up my mother's remains. I find traces of understanding through financial information my mother sent me, but I had yet to look at until today. I call the bank to see about closing our mother's accounts. There's no I'm sorry, and I'm glad for that. My brother and I talk about selling her car. But when I woke up today, I kept thinking about the temperature. It's hot in Arizona, deadly hot. Summers are times of searing heat, which often means increased death in the desert for migrants. Summers may make many of us turn inward to our homes, ourselves, our thoughts, waiting for the weather to cool. Add to this heat the complexity of a pandemic, and the heat forces a separation of people, similar to the separation that occurs on the molecular level. Things are agitated, they bump into each other. There is a frenetic pacing to heat that makes for restive days and uncomfortable nights. When my grandfather died, it was December. Even in Arizona, it was cold. I remember one day, after having come home from his services, going to get a blanket from the bedroom and being struck by the temperature. I could remedy my coldness with a blanket, whereas he was in the frozen ground of Massachusetts without any covering. I slumped to the floor and wept deeply, repeating over and over, "He must be so cold. He must be so cold." My partner found me and just held me as I wept. It felt endless. But my mother wasn't cold. She decided to be cremated, and so last night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, she was. This morning, I woke up thinking about heat, the heat of the flames on her body, the heat radiating toward the mortician conducting the cremation, the rising smoke from the ashes after the flames subsided, the heat of my residual anger from my own selfish frustrations about her, me, us. She must be so hot, I thought. She must be so hot. There is a stillness to my grief, a way it stays put. I guess I would say there's a coldness to it then. There is no movement and it freezes in place, locking me in with it. I feel planted, pulled to a center that I wish to move away from but cannot. I am stuck within grief. I am rooted by coldness. The cold grief is causing a rupture of self such that I do not even know who I am, if this is me, or if I am floating 5 feet above me. I have no clue how I get through most of my days, but I do. And I'm thankful to have people around me who, even though they do not know it, force me to try and warm up, to move, to agitate myself. I start saying yes to everything. Yes, I want to talk with you. Yes, I will spend the day with you. Yes, I will watch another episode. Yes, I will take a walk. The yeses are a way of warming up, of moving about, of trying to make it through the next hour. I'm thinking so much about temperature and wondering if this might be another connection to my mother, if her dying in the summer is a signal to always embrace the heat as a shared sensibility, a way of reconciling the discomfort it causes, much like the discomfort death, especially her death, is causing me now. Through our lives, my mother and I shared so much in common. Anyone who spent time with the both of us would regularly tell me how much I was my mother's son when I was a boy, my mother's child when I was non-binary, my mother's daughter now that I am a woman. In what would be the very last letter I would write to her, I told my mother that every time I write a capital N, I thought of her. It was her N after all. A strong left vertical line down, a little separation as I move vertically up, then into a diagonal slash down, finally into a right vertical line that curls up and out at the end. One fluid movement, 4 lines with a bit of panache at the end, a bit of flair that marked my mother. We also had the same nose. For years, I tried to hide my nose behind glasses. I would always search for unique frames to take the gaze away from what felt to me like an unseemly appendage to my face. It's strange because I've long loved distinct noses on others, loved nose piercings, which draw attention to the nose, but not on my face. Shortly after her passing, I posted a photo on Twitter of my mother and me in McGuffey Hall at Miami University. It was the 12th of February, 2015, and we were waiting for my committee to reach a final decision on if I would become a doctor. I did not want to make a large public announcement of her death, but wanted to share the gorgeous photo of my dear mother. A friend tweeted back that we shared the same nose, and in that moment, I made a pact to never disparage my nose again. One of the things my mother and I also shared over the final years of her life was an inability to sleep through the night. It did not matter what I tried, there was almost nothing I could do to find peaceful rest. Oftentimes traveling helped, but even then I was regularly fitful with my sleep. My mother and I would talk about this often. She would tell me she was up regularly throughout the night and that she would rise early, play Scrabble online in her bed until the morning light rose above the New Hampshire pines. Even one of the short verses, one of 3 in her email signatures, was about sleep, a line from Monique Duval. Mom had written the word tonight above the quote, making the line read, "Tonight, she decided to free herself, dance into the wind, create a new language." The birds fluttered around her, writing yes in the sky. She was ahead of me and thinking about joining the moon, becoming again dust and moving on from this life, this plane. I would tell her my restive state was due to work, waiting for tenure, worrying about classes, thinking about manuscripts. I'm sure some was related to heartbreak and isolation too, but I tried to protect her from that sort of internal darkness. I guess I was also trying to mother her, to help her not worry any more than she already did about me, her trans daughter who was a bit different, a bit broody, a bit stubborn, and always a big feeler. She used to tell me I had experienced so much pain in my life, which always made me wonder if she saw this as another connection between us. Today, for the first time in what feels like a long time, I was finally able to nap. I had been up before the sun writing, another thing we shared with her being an English major in college and always encouraged my writing practice, even as a child, and I was exhausted. I turned on the television, laid my head down, and drifted off. The sleep was vacant with no dreams rising up. My mother used to keep a dream journal so that after she was able to sleep, she could remember where she had been. I had sent 2 new journals for her to fill just a week before she passed, and I have spent the past week wondering if I will see her handwriting in them when I go back to clean out her house in October, wondering if I will see those similar capital N's staring back at me from the page. As I rose from my nap, I thought to myself that perhaps this was the final thing that we shared, inability to sleep at the end. The timing of my mother's death coincided with the semester teaching leave. In conversation with my department head the year prior, I had decided to save 2 course releases until the semester after I was promoted with tenure. This would allow me to not only rest after what had been an incredibly busy 5 years of professional work, but also the space and time to focus on 2 book projects, one a co-edited book on Indigenous and resistant methods, and the other a co-authored text on trans life online. The universe, however, had some different plans for my fall plans. Much of my time and energy was sucked up dealing with the aftermath of my mother's death. I spent countless hours listening to other people tell me how sorry they were and how bad they felt regarding my mother's passing. Bank and insurance representatives, distant relatives, and work colleagues. For the people with whom I am close, I spent countless hours detailing my pain, crying on the phone and in person, and learning which of my friends had also lost a parent with whom they were desperately close. To put it simply, each day unfolded as a slow-forming misery without end. As time unraveled in the wake of my mother's passing, I began to notice a pattern in my telling others about her death. There was a sentence I kept using that, while seemingly benign, has caused me pause as of late. When I talk about what has been one of the most gut-wrenching moments in my life, I almost always uttered the following sentence. Fortunately, I was on teaching leave, so I had time to be able to cope with her passing. In less than 20 words, I continually rendered the experience of grieving as wholly irreconcilable from my work in higher education. This is strange making in that my statement created a particular friction, an encounter through which, in my telling, I needed to segment portions of myself away. I somehow understood my grieving as separate from my work, and nary the two shall meet, lest my sense of professionalism start to crumble. In this past month, I have renewed a connection with a friend who also experienced an intense loss about 1.5 years before my mother passed. In talking with her, we shared stories of how we often do not talk about our losses anymore, as we assume people either do not want to hear about them or may not know what to do when we tell them. Recalling a conversation I had with another friend shortly after my mother's passing, I emailed her recently and shared, as a friend of mine said shortly after my mother died, the grief is unmetabolizable. I've never let go of that definition because nothing else seems to speak to the wholly consuming sorrow of this sort of loss. I still have days, as I'm sure you do, where the grief overwhelms me to the point of not being able to do much at all. Clearly, my grief was and is still with me, as is hers, as is our collective grief. Lest we forget there are ghosts moving about our campus from the COVID pandemic, from the AIDS pandemic, from possible presents and futures that could have been but will never be. And so all of this has led me to a series of questions about qualitative inquiry and my place in it. To be clear, I don't have answers for many of these questions, but I think that's okay, because ultimately the asking and resting with the questions feels the most important for me right now. I'll ask some of these questions here, and in so doing, I'll invite you all to think of your own questions, as well as see if some of mine resonate with you and or can be led, or it can lead to future discussion, both for our time together today, as well as for you and each other and me too after today's session is done. Some of the questions I'm resting with are as follows. If we, as some qualitative scholars in higher education studies have suggested, are the instrument of our research, what does it mean when we're broken from grief? What if our being broken isn't a momentary phenomenon, but a realization of the ongoing loss that marks our past, present, and future tenses? What do we do with the unmetabolizability of loss, especially when we may not be encouraged to spend time honoring and sitting with grief? What would it mean to notice loss through grieving and recognize this as the work rather than a distraction from it? What would it take to slow down and truly learn to be with each other in our grief? How are the systems in which we continue to comply unable and unwilling to let us do this collaborative learning? What is your role, my role, our role in rethinking grief as necessary opening up and opening toward each other and ourselves with softness? How can rethinking grief be an act of gift work for ourselves and each other, especially in a profession and a field that persists through rendering some of us sub and non-human? And so that's it's a little bit of where I'm at right now with some of my thinking. Portions of this talk came from some unpublished grief writing that I did in the 7 or 8 days that followed my mother's passing almost, well, more than a year and a half ago at this point. Some of this also came from a piece that I found out actually just yesterday that was accepted in About Campus called Sitting Shiva with Grief. So, you know, if you read About Campus, then you'll probably see some similar things in a few months or possibly a year based on how the publishing pipeline works. The final image that I'm sharing with you all is from the deck of my mother's cottage. That's Freeze's Pond in the background. And the small green patch right next to the base of the pond is actually the last place that my mother rested. We released her ashes there in October a number of years ago when we went back to close up her house. So I just wanted to share that with folks. But now I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to folks at QualLabs.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and vulnerable and emotional work, Dr. Nicolazzo. I know at least I am very, very interested in seeing how this vulnerable emotional work can show up in qualitative research. So we are going to start the Q&A right now. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will ask as many questions that we have as our time will allow. So I think my first question, and this is one coming straight from me, how do you find the courage to put in this vulnerability in works that you know might be published? Or yeah, if you could just speak to that vulnerability and how you do it, that would be lovely.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment. I'm not sure if it's courageous. At least I guess I don't think about it as courageous. I think about it as the place where I need to be writing right now. You know, I don't have much of a connection with this person, so I'm sure at some point I will bump into her at a conference and tell her how much she means to me in terms of her scholarship. But I think a lot about Lisa Matsai when I do some of this work. Dr. Lisa Matsai, who does a lot of post-qualitative work. I'm sure many people in this space are familiar with her work. And she wrote something at one point in time that talked about about data that bruises people and that stays with people much longer after they've finished reading a piece, right? And I think that that's the type of work that is animating me right now, to think about these bruises and what stays with us and what's lasting with us. And quite frankly, after my mother passed and after I got through my work with these two books that I was using to cope with my mother's passing, there was nothing else I could think about and nothing else that I could envision writing than thinking about and writing about grief work. So yeah, that's, I think, why I've tracked in that particular direction, and why I feel that it's really important to do it. I think the only other piece that I would add is that this recent COVID pandemic is really reminding me about how unable higher education as a project is. They're unable to hold and rest with grief, right? So it's not just COVID, it's also, as I mentioned, the AIDS pandemic, that we have ghosts walking through our campus, and people are unwilling to kind of talk about how these ghosts necessarily alter the work that we do. So it seems important in that respect as well.
Well, thank you for that. I also have a question from Chelsea, who wanted to thank you again for your vulnerable emotional work. And she was wondering if you have any thoughts about how affect could be more fully integrated into qualitative research writing, which in her experience can sometimes feel disconnected and unemotional.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Chelsea. I think, and this is not a new thought. I'm guessing that many people are probably on board with this idea in this space, but I think many of the journals that we write for, particularly journals behind paywalls, and especially qualitative pieces that we write and qualitative spaces that we write for, oftentimes demand that we write toward formulas, right? We need to write toward a formula in order to get an R&R and then in order to get published, because that's, again, part of the institutional demand, right, of how our work fits into largely a system that has been created by and then benefits quantitative thinking and quantitative scholarship, right? And maybe quantitative is unfair. I don't think so, but maybe. And maybe I would say positivist frameworks, right? And positivist ideologies. Penny's work in, and I really appreciate your work, Penny, and so glad to be in this space with you. But your work with a collective of folks that you were writing with a number of years ago, talking about the scientism in ideological thinking through higher ed scholarship and through qualitative research is really powerful, and I think only gets stronger and stronger every single year, right? So I think that that's kind of the field that we're in, right? The thing that I keep on thinking about, though, is this one comment that my advisor, Elisa Abus at Miami University, made to me a number of years ago. I was really petrified, actually, to write some pieces and from my dissertation, and she was saying, I really think you need to write an overview piece and send it to the Journal of College Student Development. And I was like, I don't know, Elisa, they're not going to accept it. I don't do developmental work. I don't know. And she said, I think you really just need to write what you need to write and send it where it needs to be sent. And that has been something that's been really helpful. I would like to think, right, that there are some good folks that are shepherding things to reviewers that are understanding of the work that we do as qualitative and post-qualitative folks. And that we can also be good community with each other in terms of, before we send manuscripts out, sending them to each other and thinking about, are you making the best and clearest case possible to write what you need to write and have it published where it needs to be published, right? And sometimes that means that we submit towards places that aren't, quote unquote, top tier journals or aren't well-read in our own disciplines and subdisciplines, right? Like I think one beautiful place to do some of this work is qualitative inquiry. And I also, like, again, big shout out to Penny Pasquay, because apparently the Review of Higher Education publishes affect theory pieces now, right? So yeah, sometimes there are breakages in these systems that maybe seem overly focused on scientism and empiricism. So I don't know if that's a whole heck of a great answer, but yeah, maybe some ways to think about how we can undermine the system that was never really built with our thinking in mind.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I also wanted to highlight a note in the chat from Dr. Susan Iverson, who says that what Dr. Nicolazzo has shared with us today reminds her of Laurel Richardson's Last Rites, WRITES, a daybook for a dying friend. It was published in 2007. If anyone is interested in trying to learn more about this. So I have another question from Daniel. I'm gonna butcher your last name. I apologize. Matamoros, hopefully. So he asks, processing grief looks so different for so many people, and it's always so personal. So much of how we process grief is informed by our histories and experiences and traumas. So qualitatively, should we focus on this type of writing on processing our own grief? Do you have any tips on how to study the grief and processing experience of others without seeming like we are taking advantage of the trauma of others?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful question. You know, I know for sure that there's someone else in this room who's probably more capable at answering some of this than I am. And I'll maybe invite her into the space in a second. But I think the important thing that I want to share right now is that, at least for me in this moment in time, the writing is about myself and my own experiences. So I'm trying to think about this work autoethnographically. So how is it that my experiences might illuminate and illustrate some things that I find happening in broader institutional cultures and across this thing that we call the project of education. In that sense, for me, it's not about taking advantage of my own experiences, but really thinking about, is this a good time, and is this information that I want to be sharing with people? It's taken me quite a long time to really even think about starting this work after my mother passed, right? It certainly wasn't automatic and very quick to be able to share some of this work publicly, and probably won't for quite a long time. In terms of processing, I think there are various different ways that we all do that. Part of my processing is actually through writing. I've always been a writer. It's something, again, like I mentioned, that my mother and I share in common. And so that writing and reading has been a way for me to understand myself and myself in the world. Similarly, I look for, right, I'm trying to move towards the places that scare me. And in particular, I'm petrified at thinking about death. My mother, at the end of her life, actually was a hospice. She was a chaplain for a hospice organization in New Hampshire, and would literally sit with people while they were dying. And so many of our conversations over the last 3 years of her life were really around my discomfort and her comfort with death and dying. Kind of, interesting how that happens, right? So for me, moving closer to the spaces that scare me and the things that scare me, I'm actually taking part in an 8-week online certification program at the University of Vermont this summer. That's an end-of-life doula program. I'm not planning quite yet in terms of switching careers. So I know I have a number of doc students and candidates in the classroom. I'm not leaving the University of Arizona yet. But I do want to think a little bit more about death and the dying process and what that may mean for me. But how we process is all different, right? And to kind of circle back to that piece about someone in this room being able to answer the question about, mining people's traumas better than me. I see Trisha Shalka is in the room, and I wonder, Trisha, as someone who does trauma studies work in education, if you might have some things to offer in terms of how you think about trauma-informed work and trauma-informed scholarship. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I feel like you can answer that so much better than I can.
Sure, thanks, C. What I was thinking in relation to what you were sharing, Z, and with this question, I really appreciate today what you did in just opening up the space for it to be okay to sit with things that feel uncomfortable and not turning away and not looking away. And it reminds me of, there's an article by Catherine Becker-Blees and Jennifer Fried, and they talk about the dangers of not asking sometimes. So when we're talking about trauma or difficult knowledges, that sometimes we kind of shy away from going there, and we're worried we will create more harm by doing so. But sometimes there's more harm created by not being able to have that space to sit with things that are hard and difficult. And at the same time that we need to do that mindfully and carefully and with a humbleness that we don't know it all the time, and sort of the importance of listening and being very careful and mindful as we proceed. So those are just some things I was kind of reflecting on and listening to your talk, C, and then in relation to that question.
Thank you both for your input on that question. I have a comment and then a question, both from Samantha, I think it's Samantha Goose, who wanted to raise up that the DSM, which is the guidelines used to make clinical mental health diagnoses, just added persistent complex bereavement disorder as a clinical diagnosis. And she thinks that this signals the salience of attending to grief and affect in our work, especially critically examining what it means to classify grief as a diagnosable mental illness. So she just wanted to share that comment, and then she had a question intended for Dr. Nicolazzo, but if, oh my God, I've already forgotten her name. I apologize. If anyone else wants to chime in with answers, what are the ethics of attending to grief in qualitative research?
Yeah, that's such a good question. This semester I have the privilege and the joy to teach a class that I'm calling Resistant Methods. It's an advanced qualitative methods class, and we're reading a lot of Black studies, Indigenous studies, and queer and trans studies work. And I've been thinking a lot about ethics in terms of field formation, in terms of qualitative inquiry. I think one of the things that I'm thinking most about in relation to this particular question is these two ideas, which are drawn from Indigenous studies scholarship around being in right relationship and thinking about accountability, right? To whom are you accountable, and how do you think about community accountability? So in terms of thinking about grief work, and I would probably even argue ethnographic work, part of what I try to do is really think about the communities that I'm writing about and writing for. I think that it's important to think about, after you write something and as you're starting to submit something, am I comfortable sharing this with the communities that I'm a part of and that are a part of this work? Is this something that I would be willing to have tough conversations about if these communities maybe disagree with my interpretations? And to what end and for whom is this work, right, responsible? So am I writing something because I think it will get published in a top tier journal because that's what I need in order to make my way through these academic streets? Or am I writing something that moves people, that moves scholarship, that tries to agitate some things, or does work that supports and benefits broader publics, right? I think you know, as I'm looking at Chase Catalano, hi Chase, on the screen, I'm thinking a lot about the fact that I just posed that as an either or, and really we might need to think about it as a both and for many of us, as Chase often likes to remind me, right? So we can do things that certainly will be helpful in terms of our careers, especially as people who are academics, right, and people who are in this space together. And also, I think first and foremost, we really need to be thinking about who we're accountable to, and how what we do shows we're in right relationship with the communities that we're a part of and that we seek to be a part of.
Thank you for that. I have another question here from Benjamin Pollard. He says, to the extent that qualitative work is a pathway to theory building, Bell Hooks said, I saw in theory, then a location for healing. And Benjamin thinks of this quote in response to your question about being broken as an instrument for qualitative research. So how does being broken sit alongside the power of critical theory building for healing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure that I have a great answer for it, because I'm not at the healing part yet. I think that again, if I think about my discomfort and really trying to get close and saddle up with my discomfort, some of that means staying with the brokenness and not trying to rush myself through a particular healing process. You know, I truly meant what I said about that email I sent to my friend literally a week ago, that you know, there's not a day that I don't wake up thinking about the fact that I don't have a mother, and there's not a day that goes by that I'm not crushed with the overwhelming loss of my mother not being with me anymore, and I think it's really important for me to take stock of that and to be with that feeling rather than maybe rushing toward healing. That said, like, glory be to Belle. I truly believe her work, and I'm deeply appreciative of all that she gifted us with. In fact, I had the good fortune to meet Belle a number of years ago, actually at The Ohio State University, which was a beautiful moment. And yeah, I mean, I think that critical theory can certainly be a site of healing. I'm just not sure that I'm there yet. So I'm not sure I can maybe answer that question fully.
I think that was a wonderful answer, even if it was inconclusive, if you might say. So we have just a few more minutes left. I have another question from Melvin Whitehead, who says, can you speak more to how you were thinking about the concept of ghosts on our campus? You mentioned this word a few times and just wanted to hear more, particularly in the effect of ghosts on our work and day-to-day lives on college campuses.
Yeah, certainly. Hi, Melvin. Thanks for the lovely question. I'm thinking a little bit with Avery Gordon's book, Ghostly Matters, which if folks haven't read it, is a really beautiful text. I'm also thinking with one of my dear colleagues at the University of Utah, Irene Yoon, who has written some really beautiful pieces about haunting. So she thinks about ghosts and haunting as an affective, more than metaphor, but an affective space to think about, in particular how systemic oppressions pervade systems of education. And for me, I think part of the way I'm thinking about this, Melvin, is that you know, there are quite literally people who couldn't even think about education as a possibility because they passed before they could think about it, right? So when I think about COVID, right, I think that there are people who maybe were on college campuses but are no longer, people who couldn't think about getting to college campuses because they passed. Similar with the AIDS pandemic, right? If we think about, and certainly in thinking about my work around gender and transness previous to this turn around grief, if we think about how AIDS has has continued to shape particularly Black trans populations. We can think about the fact that there are people who should be on our college campuses or should have had the opportunity to think about being on college campuses who are not. And I think about their presence through absence, which is something that I talk about in the piece that Penny put in the chat, this piece that I had published in the review, right? That just because people aren't physically there doesn't mean that they're not changing and animating the space through absence. So that's some of the work that I'm trying to do and trying to think about. And yeah, I'll also say this this co-edited book that that's coming out in a couple of months. My co-editor Amanda Taccini and I had the great pleasure to invite Irene and one of Irene's collaborators, Grace Chen, to write a chapter on haunting. So, you know, feel free to take a peek at that if you're interested. I think the book should be coming out from Stylist sometime in July. So.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, we are almost done for the day. So Dr. Nicolazzo, did you have any concluding thoughts that you wanted to share with us before we wrap up?
I think just thanks again for allowing me to stumble through this all. I really appreciate it. For folks that have a keen eye too, you'll notice that one of the photos behind me is of my mother. My mother is in the middle of the photo, and then my brother and I are very young along the side of her. So it's nice to think about her being in this space. And yeah, I appreciate you allowing me a very comfortable and very supportive environment to be able to share some work that's really important to me. So, thanks.
We were absolutely, excuse my cat as he jumps off me. We were very happy to have you today and grateful that you were willing to be vulnerable with us. So I will share my screen once more and then turn it back over to Ruth.
Thank you, Dr. Nicolazzo, and thank you, Shay, for your very insightful remarks. And that was a wonderful session, and I hope you all have enjoyed it as much as I did. So just to conclude for today, so we're the QualLab team, so we offer services. So if you want to book a consultation with us in the future, please scan the QR code, and we are also available to talk to you in the classroom. So yeah, please feel free to contact us. And thank you so much for staying with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time in our next lunch talk. Thank you.